Thank you, Omar and Jeffy. And FINSIA is pleased to be partnering with Jeffy on this global summit. And we've got a fantastic panel of experts to give you a sense of what's happening in our region. To give you some context, FINSIA is the leading professional body in financial services in Australia and New Zealand, covering the areas of banking and securities. And what I'd like to do now is to give you a sense of the region before you hear from our panel. So, Australia, as you're aware, very large country, world's sixth largest country, population of nearly 26 million. What may be news to some of you not so familiar with Australia, highly urbanised, so despite all that huge space, and indeed 90% of the population living in 0.22% of the land. So, and most of those living very close to the coast. The population has been growing quite strongly, largely driven by migration. And you'll see from the age demographics here that relative to many other developed economies, we've had quite a healthy age demographic in terms of those of working age, again, reflecting that migration. A sense of the makeup of Australia, a very diverse country. So around about a third of Australians were born overseas and have migrated here. And from a wide range of areas, particularly recently significant migration from China and India. And I should also obviously mention Indigenous Australians, about 3.3% of the population, the oldest living culture in the world. And religion and land are the key drivers of Aboriginal culture. Colonisation had a devastating impact on the Aboriginal community, and we have many ongoing issues, and I'm sure at some point today perhaps we'll talk about some of those with regards to significant economic and health gaps, and issues with regards to respect for the preservation of Aboriginal culture, and refer to some recent events in that regard, which many may be familiar with. Australia, a very strong trading nation, so manufacturing has been in decline. We have a very significant services economy, and that's been growing further. As a trading nation, the majority of our trade goes to Asia, over 60%, and a very large proportion of that, as you can see, going to China. Significant trade across a number of different sectors. Everyone would be familiar with mining and agriculture, and other precious metals and rare metals and so on. Foodstuffs, wine, some of which do very much rely on Australia's reputation for a good environment, a clean environment. And if we look at some of the recent data on Australia, I think everyone will be wondering, well, kind of what's happened with regards to COVID. Australia has been lucky in terms of the management of COVID. Case numbers have been very low. And whilst there was an initial dip, as you can see, early in 2020, we've seen a significant rebound in production and retail sales. So it has been very much a V-shaped impact, if you like. Little bit of political background. Australia has a federal system, 6 states, the federal government responsible primarily for trade, foreign affairs, defence, economic policy. It has the main tax powers, and hence financial services regulation largely falls within the federal system, while the states look after service provision and infrastructure, health, education, planning, and law and order. A democracy with legislative power sat with a bicameral house, executive power through Governor General, so the head of state, and separation obviously of judicial powers. Current government is what we describe as centre-right, and the key political issues at the moment are certainly the economy and the impact of COVID and how that's been managed, and how that'll be managed going forwards. Vaccination of COVID, which is a very key issue at the moment. Climate change and energy, there's been a huge discussion, and I'll go into that a little bit further. Social issues, gender equity, and foreign relations, particularly with regards to relations with China, the largest trading partner, as you'll have seen on the previous slide, and that has been tense, let's say, in recent times. If we look at the climate change, I talk about a disconnect here. The government position, we have not yet committed to net zero by 2050. It's seen as something that would be good to achieve, but by no means a commitment. A focus on research investment, but Australia doesn't have a carbon trading scheme or similar market-based mechanisms. And a big debate about ongoing investment in fossil fuels, the role of gas in transition, and coal mines. Australia has a bicameral parliament, executive power, the head of state rests with the Governor-General, and separation of the judiciary. If we look at some of the key political issues in Australia, currently we've had a centre-right government since 2013, but current issues are COVID, the economy, and COVID vaccination, so the health aspects of COVID. Climate change and energy, a huge debate, and I'll have a little more to say on that in a second. Social issues and gender equity has been a very hot issue. And foreign relations, primarily China, and you'll have noted China as Australia's largest trading partner. That's significant for the economy, and the relationship has been tense in recent times. In terms of climate change and some of the politics around that, the government position is we have not as yet committed to net zero by 2050. The government have said that that would be good to achieve, but that's a long way from a commitment. A focus on research investment rather has been the approach, and the government's rejected carbon pricing and similar market-based mechanisms. There's an ongoing investment in fossil fuels, which is certainly controversial and having a huge amount of debate. Meanwhile, business is very much getting on with sort of climate change discussions and does recognise, as such a major trading nation, the importance of climate change and the global context of that. We're seeing the banks investing in green finance skills, reviewing lending policies, and considering their obligations or responsibilities in that regards. And an interesting recent survey highlighted climate crisis was a bigger concern than the pandemic for Australian businesses. There's been a shifting position in the general population as well. So this chart really highlights that climate change has grown significantly as an issue for Australians. And again, perhaps something of a disconnect with some catch-up yet to occur, perhaps in the political response to what is certainly a growing concern in Australians generally. Okay, and if we look at some of the investment now in Australia, Australia relies significantly on foreign investment, and that's been growing strongly also over recent times. And you can see the source of that may come as a surprise that by far the largest sources, United States, UK, China and so on, relatively small as percentage terms, but growing strongly. And a little more information with regards to the banking system and the superannuation system. Australia has a strong pension savings system, and kind of highlights there the depth of savings. The banking system is highly concentrated, and 4 major banks do dominate, and you can see that applies also in terms of the assets held by those banks. Superannuation is growing strongly, and that's supported by compulsory superannuation schemes through employers. Australian Sustainable Finance Initiative, just to briefly mention what is happening, I'm sure this will come up in the panel today. There has been a industry-led initiative to establish a roadmap for sustainable finance, supported by many of the major institutions, and that roadmap was launched in November 2020, and as I say, may well get some discussion amongst our panel today. The regulatory system for financial services, we have 4 key regulators, and with the responsibilities set out there. I'll focus in on APRA, the prudential regulator, who have issued risk guidance and taken a leading role, certainly been very open in terms of their expectations and growing expectations of the consideration of the impact of climate change and the prudential risks that are associated with climate change, and seeking better practice in terms of how those risks are defined and managed as we go forwards. And I think just to finish in terms of this overview of Australia, certainly highlighting, there are a lot of challenges out there focused on some of the environmental issues, but you can imagine how that's impacting on agriculture and other aspects of the economy. And there's a lot of concern with regards to, for instance, the impact on the Great Barrier Reef of not just climate change, temperature change and bleaching that's occurring, but also the runoff of fertilisers or indeed mine pollution that may impact on some of these very fragile environments. Quickly cover on New Zealand and the many similarities between Australia and New Zealand, and as you can see, it's population of 5 million, it's similar size to the UK, but again, significant migration and relatively young population given its development that again is being fed very much by that migration that's ongoing. The New Zealand economy similarly very much services based, and although with a more significant relatively manufacturing sector than Australia. New Zealand too has been very effective in terms of its management of COVID, and we've seen this V-shaped recovery occurring over recent quarters, and returning very much towards pre-COVID levels already. New Zealand, the politics, if you like, of climate change are quite different, and New Zealand's had an emissions trading scheme since 2008, and has been a leader in some regards. It's the world's first country to bring in a law forcing financial firms to report on climate change, and it has set out a target of carbon neutral by 2050, and highlighted the role that the financial services sector needs to play. I thought it'd be interesting to highlight for New Zealand and Australia, though, in terms of the per capita levels of greenhouse gas emissions, a lot of work to be done relative to other countries. And New Zealand, the regulation of financial services largely through the Reserve Bank, and Reserve Bank conducted a recent industry survey in terms of the impact of climate change. You can see the outcomes of that survey at the top on the right hand side here, in terms of the concerns from the banking sector and the opportunities as seen from the banking sector, and then below that the perspective of investors from life and non-life industries. New Zealand too, a lot of concern around the impact on the ecosystem, biodiversity, and impact on the environment of change. So just highlighting again some of the biodiversity events which reflect some of the challenges around climate change, pollution, and other similar concerns. So I will leave that overview there. Hope that has been useful.